The Arkham Horror RPG, is it a hit or a bust? Our brutally honest review.
Well, let's find out what we need to and get out of here.
If you've ever stepped foot in a board game store at any point in time in the last 20 or so years, you've probably seen an Arkham Horror game of some kind. I'm not talking about a Lovecraft game. I'm talking about the Arkham Horror franchise. Now, this is a combination of pulp action and cosmic horror that has inspired players for 20 years to shoot ghouls in the face with a Tommy gun, throw Molotov cocktails at Shoggoths, and beat Cthulhu with a baseball bat. Now, Asmodee has created a brand new tabletop RPG featuring the setting, its characters, and its stories. But is Arkham Horror, the role-playing game, a hit, or is it a bust? Well, we played through about half of the starter set, that's all we had time for, to find out. Now, to get the important stuff out of the way first, I'm not going to hold back my opinion until the end of the video, but you should do the likes and subscribes now while we're talking about it. The new starter set is one of the most board-gamey tabletop RPG starter sets I've ever opened. That's not necessarily a bad thing, given the roots of Arkham Horror, which is, of course, a board game. And I will say that a lot of the handouts make for some really fun mini-games that engage my players and ate a lot of time in our play sessions in a very good way. But as for the actual dynamic pool system, this new game system made just for Arkham Horror, it had a novel approach to combat that my players seemed to grasp after a few rounds, but it did come with a few rough patches. Also, the starter set itself, the rulebook for it, struggled to explain narrative scenes properly at the outset, which forced both my players and myself to, well, fumble through several encounters before really demonstrating how these out-of-combat moments are supposed to go within the game, which I feel is kind of a miss. The new starter set adapts the storyline found in the base set for Arkham Horror the card game, with players investigating a series of corpse mutilations and disappearances throughout Arkham. The starter set comes with 5 pre-generated characters, all of whom are pulled from other Arkham Horror games, and each come with their own abilities and special knacks, which feel pretty familiar if you've ever played one of those other Arkham Horror games. Now, I thought the choice to adapt an existing storyline was interesting, in part because I remember playing through this storyline and kind of being frustrated with some of the choices presented to me during the course of the branching storyline. My big question here was, would I get the chance to make some different choices and maybe impact the storyline in a different way? Not quite sure about that, but it was still interesting to see if I could do anything different this time, instead of literally having a binary choice. Now, Arkham Horror uses the dynamic pool system, which Ed Studios created just for the game. This system uses a pool of 6-sided dice. Usually you start off with 6, and those dice replenish at the start of every round of combat or at the beginning of every narrative scene. Now, players can spend a single dice without rolling to take a simple action, doing things like moving or interacting with an object, say, pulling out my gun or my baseball bat. Or they can choose to roll 1 or more dice to make a complex action. Now, when players make a complex action, which is really any action with a chance of failure, they commit to rolling a number of dice, and they determine how many dice they want to commit to the roll beforehand, and make a check against one of their stats to determine if they succeed or fail. If their dice results show at least one number that's equal to or higher than the stat that they're checking against, they succeed. Now, certain knacks and items also reward players for rolling multiple successes on a check, typically by dealing extra damage to opponents. Now, players can also choose to hold back dice on their turn to save for reactions, which gives them a chance to negate incoming damage via one of 3 types of checks, depending on what's happening to you. There's a certain type of stat you check against if you're trying to dodge a melee attack, a different type of check that you roll against in case you're trying to dodge a ranged attack, and yet another stat that you check against in case you're trying to avoid magic. The dice pool also serves as a health pool for players. Whenever a player takes damage, they reduce the number of dice in their pool, and they can typically only replenish it by straining and taking an injury, which is determined by rolling on an injury table. Some spells and enemy attacks can also cause horror damage, which causes a player to swap out some of their standard dice with horror dice. Now, horror dice can still be used in checks, but if a player rolls a 1 on a horror dice, they take a trauma, also determined by rolling on a trauma table. Players can typically survive a few injuries or take a couple of trauma, but the more they take, the greater likelihood that they permanently die. Now, the give and take in the dynamic pool system ensures that players always have a chance to succeed, even if they aren't good at a particular action. A player with a poor lore stat, for instance, who needs to interact with a mystic barrier, they can choose to spend all of their dice to try to overcome the odds, as they only need to roll a single 6 to succeed. Meanwhile, a player who's skilled with ranged weapons and has a stat like a 4+, they may decide whether to commit extra dice to a roll to potentially trigger one of their gun's special abilities, or they may decide to hold dice back so they have less of a chance to roll a 1, which means that they're starting to run out of ammo. Now, where the dynamic pool system struggles is during narrative scenes, which are built with role-playing in mind, of course. Now, while the game has stats that seem built for these role-playing moments, things like intuition and wits, the starter set doesn't really give players or GMs any idea on how to work through these narrative scenes and what players should do when they want to make a check. Is it the player who determines what stat they're checking against, or the GM? At least not on the outset. Eventually, when you get to the second act, they start to explain, how all of these narrative scenes work. Now, the problem with that is that there's multiple narrative scenes in the first act, and, players don't really have an idea of what they're supposed to do with their dice pool, and they can choose to make complex actions during those narrative scenes, and there's no explanation of what actually happens. It was kind of a big whiff to open the book, set the scene, and then have my players ask what to do with the dice in front of them, and the rulebook not provide a good example, at least not right on the pages that we were working through. The book does get there eventually, but you're sort of stuck winging it until Act 2. And that's not really a good thing for GMs, at least not for me. It's also kind of unclear if there's supposed to be consequences to failing. I mean, you'd think there would be, but it doesn't really spell out how you're supposed to penalize your players if they fail. Do they break something? Just, nothing happened? Is it meant to be played up for laughs or horror? There's nothing like that in there. It just always kind of assumes that you're going to succeed. And that's also not the greatest thing. Although I will say that could be left deliberately vague for the GM to decide so as not to overwhelm total newcomers to role-playing. I'm assuming that there's going to be a lot more guidance on narrative scenes in the full core rulebook, but this whole narrative scene business, it was kind of a weak point of the starter set, and you don't play a role-playing game without narrative scenes and rules on how you're supposed to work your way through them and resolve tension and potential failures and things like that. The starter set comes with a lot of components, especially tokens that are meant to track ammunition and supplies and horror and damage. There are also a few puzzles and handouts included in the starter set, and I will say my players absolutely love them. Although the sliding puzzles continue to vex my wife a full day after playing. The sheer number of components make the game feel very similar to a board game, especially other Arkham Horror games that typically have a lot of pieces and tokens. Now, I will say this isn't exactly a unique thing. I've opened up other starter boxes that have lots of tokens too, usually to help with combat and whatnot. But I can't think of another game that has tokens specifically to track ammunition or how cracked your bat gets when bashing ghouls' heads in. That's usually what a pencil is for. The character sheets aren't really made for pencils though. They're made for components, which I thought was interesting. Not really my cup of tea, but interesting. Now, as an Arkham Horror veteran, there's a lot that feels familiar in the Arkham Horror role-playing game. From how horror and injuries work to how weapons or spells come with a risk of running out of ammo or breaking the weapon or the spell, failing. It all feels like this game really builds on existing mechanics from other Arkham Horror games, and the designers over at Edge Studios adapted them for more of a free-form format. Given that the Arkham Horror games are generally a lot of fun, I personally have loved them, basically since I started playing board games like 20 years ago. It's really smart of Edge Studios to build off of Arkham Horror games, even though the box may feel a bit too much like a board game for some longtime RPG players. The players in my test group, they really enjoyed Arkham Horror, the role-playing game starter set, especially, again, the puzzles and the handouts offered in the box. They absolutely ate that stuff up. We had one session where they spent 45 minutes just trying to solve a coded letter. The dynamic pool system, I wouldn't call it intuitive, but my players were eventually able to understand how the combat side of it worked within maybe 2 to 3 rounds. Now, as the GM, I was disappointed by the lack of guidance outside of combat in the starter set, but I was able to muddle through scenes without too much issue. Come on, I've run plenty of sessions on different types of games before, so this was nothing overwhelming for me. I just would have liked to know a little bit more how I'm supposed to tell my players to use their dice pools. But I'm guessing there's going to be more guidance once the full game launches later this year, so I'm not too worried about that right now. Honestly, I think there's a lot of promise here with this game, enough for me to want to finish up this starter set adventure when I come back from Gen Con, and I want to check out the next release, which assumably will be the full rulebook. However, I will say that, some RPG players will look at the box as a frustrating experience. It's not the most polished. I will say Edge Studios, I think this might be their first full starter box, and you can kind of see some of the pain points in the adventure. So just be mindful of that if you decide to buy it. I enjoyed it, but if you are looking for a super polished experience, you're probably not going to find it with this game. Anyways, that's our thoughts about Arkham Horror, the role-playing game. Let us know what you think if you get a chance to play it at Gen Con or shortly afterwards. It goes on sale literally right after Gen Con. So let us know what you think. Tell us your thoughts, leave a comment, and don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons.